It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Cheryl Misak, our Priestley Lecturer for 2023. This lecture series was endowed in the name of Professor F.E.L. Priestley, that's Francis Ethelbert Lewis Priestley. They just don't make names like Ethelbert anymore, who taught English at the University of Toronto and had strong roots in southern Alberta. The terms of reference of the endowment state that the lectures should, quote, further the tradition of humane letters so strongly advanced in the works of Professor Priestley. Our speaker has made highly distinguished contributions to this very tradition, a tradition that needs all the support and defense it can get in our present so very perilous times. Cheryl Misak is currently teaching philosophy at the University of Toronto, excuse me, at the rank of a university professor, the highest academic rank at that institution. From 2009 to 13, she was the vice president and provost of the University of Toronto, and she's held numerous other senior academic appointments. She has published 6 books, the most recent of which is a biography of the great Cambridge philosopher F.P. Ramsey, and that's what she's going to tell us about tonight. She has also published a very long list of professional articles and papers, which I did not even attempt to count. We should be very proud that Professor Misak is a graduate of our university. She graduated with great distinction in 1983, receiving a BA in philosophy and the gold medal for the arts for that year. She then did a master's in philosophy at Columbia University. She won a Rhodes Scholarship, which she took to the University of Oxford, completing her DPhil in 1988. She's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and among her many awards and distinctions, she was named the University of Lethbridge Alumna of the Year for 2009. I quote from her online profile, which states her research spans American pragmatism, the history of analytic philosophy, moral and political philosophy, and philosophy of medicine. Professor Misak is a thinker of great erudition and breadth, but as we are about to find out, she uses the English language with a clarity and directness that I believe would have pleased Professor Priestley himself. And so with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Cheryl.
Thank you very much, Kenton. Thank you for the kind invitation. It's really wonderful to be back here. My parents are here, my brother's in the audience, my mother's friends, my old tennis friends from the Lethbridge Tennis Club. So it's really great to be here. Also, my old teacher, Mike Kabara, is here, who introduced me to American pragmatism, and we will see in the talk that follows this is relevant to tonight's lecture. So I'm going to talk to you today about this quite remarkable young man, because he never had the chance to grow old. If you can do basic subtraction, you can see that he died at the age of 26. So the subtitle of the book is from the great Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter, who said this of Ramsey: "Certainly that young man was a true product of Cambridge," that's Cambridge, England, "at its best. Nobody can have any doubt about it who ever met him," which the present writer did but once. "In discussion, he impressed one curiously like an overgrown 2-year-old who misbehaves on the race course from sheer excess of powers." So this isn't a 2-year-old toddler, this is a 2-year-old racehorse who is champing at the bit to get started with the race. And Ramsey was a superstar in at least 4 disciplines, depending on how you count: pure mathematics, economics, subjective probability and expected utility theory, and philosophy. Next slide. In pure mathematics, he has a branch of mathematics named after him, Ramsey theory, and this branch of mathematics studies the conditions under which order occurs. And I know there's at least one very serious mathematician in the audience who will know about Ramsey theory, but basically he proved that complete disorder is not possible. He also is the founder of subjective probability or expected utility theory, which underpins all of economics, all of social science, much of medicine, and all of Bayesian statistics. But Ramsey himself would have hated what became of his proving these theorems, because he saw that utility, or maximizing expected utility, is not realistic. He said no real person can have a set of beliefs that are perfectly coherent in terms of the probability calculus. So when he figured out how to measure partial belief, and then figured out, asserted that an ideally rational person would be a person who always kept their probabilities in line with the probability calculus and maximized their utility, he said he was talking about a highly idealized system to which those actual people, especially the speaker, i.e. himself, only in part approximate. In economics, he published 2 papers in Keynes's very well-known economic journal. One was called A Mathematical Theory of Saving, and the other was a contribution to the theory of taxation. And when this very eminent journal had its 125th anniversary in, I think it was 2015, they published a volume of their 14 greatest hits. So the 14 best papers that appeared in one of the best economics journals in the world, and they published both of Ramsey's papers, Ramsey's only 2 papers in economics, in that greatest hits volume. And the editor had some explaining to do, because there were a lot of economists who thought, well, my paper should be in there, or my teacher's paper should be in there. And the editors had to say, yes, but each of these papers really founded an entire sub-branch of economics, and so we had to include both of them. One of these branches of economics was called optimal taxation theory, and the other is optimal savings theory. And these tend to be left-leaning branches of economics, supposing a more benevolent view of the role of government than is the norm in like utility maximizing economics. In philosophy, he's got a bunch of things named after him as well. Ramsey sentences, the Ramsey test for conditionals, and a number of people have tried to add up all the things that are named after Ramsey in mathematics, economics, and philosophy, and the number hovers around 51. My favorite is number 3 on that list there, the Ramsey effect. And this was something that the philosopher Donald Davidson made up 30 years ago or so. He said the Ramsey effect is when you think you have a really brilliant thought and you discover that Frank Ramsey in 1927 had it before you. Yeah. We'll see that he also had important things to say about non-technical topics, such as the meaning of life, and that's what I'm going to really focus on at the end of this talk, because we're not going to get into his technical material. Next slide. So all this, and he dies at the age of 26. Someone asked me before the talk started, they saw his dates and they said, how did he die? And I had a few very impressive medical professionals help me figure out how he died, because we had his death certificate, we had letters back and forth about the course of his illness, but no one really at the time knew how he died. It was a bit of a mystery. And what these great medics decided was highly likely was that he died from leptospirosis, or Weil's disease, which, like E. coli, you can get by swimming in rivers where cow manure gets into the water. And recently, like a year ago, a very well-known physician in England contacted me and said, I don't think he died of leptospirosis. And because she's very, very famous, she emailed Guy's Hospital in London, where Ramsey died, and I had emailed them and got his death certificate. She emailed them and got them to go into the basement and actually dig up the 15 pages of notes written at his bedside as he died. And so we've just published a paper in the Wellcome Medical Journal titled who or what killed Frank Ramsey, and we still think it's leptospirosis or Weil's disease. So he had a liver infection and just very quickly deteriorated and was taken to hospital and died. Next slide. So why did we wait so long, 100 years, for an intellectual biography of this really great thinker? Well, it's rather a daunting project. You have to be able to write about very technical topics in pure mathematics, in economics, in philosophy, and you had to be Frank Ramsey to manage to do all of that. I'll speak in a minute about how I tried to manage it. And some attempts were started by, but not finished. And most significantly, an attempt was started by a young woman in Oxford named Laurie Kahn, who in the early 1980s was going to write for her DPhil thesis a biography of Frank Ramsey, very ambitious for a doctoral student. And she realized that in the early 1980s, there were all sorts of people around who knew Ramsey. His wife was still, his widow was still alive, his siblings were still alive, his friends were still alive. So she went around with a tape recorder, and for 2 years she interviewed people. And I tracked her down. It was very difficult because she'd married and divorced, and there was no trace of her on the internet, but I finally tracked her down, and I'm happy to tell the story in the Q&A if you like, but I managed to get hold of those tapes, and we have some sound bites. I have some sound bites for you tonight, and they're really voices from the past speaking to us now. Next slide. So the way that I dealt with the impossible task of writing about all of Ramsey's work while not being a high-powered mathematician or economist is that I got the best high-powered mathematicians, economists, and the like to write guest boxes where they explained for, say, the serious mathematician just what Ramsey theory in mathematics was. So this is a screenshot from the guest box of the best Ramsey theorist in the world, a fellow named Ron Graham, who's at San Diego. And as you can see, that number, that Ramsey number in the middle there is like, you have to be a very serious mathematician to even read it. And as you can see, right under that number, Ron Graham offered $1,000 US prize to anyone who could prove what is up there on the screen. Now, Ron Graham, the last thing that Ron Graham read before he died was the Ramsey biography. He took ill and died right afterwards, and so I think I'm on the hook for that $1,000. And so I know there's one serious mathematician here, and if you can do that, come and talk to me, and I will ask someone who knows what they're talking about whether you've got the right answer to the question. Next slide. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about Ramsey's life, which was mighty interesting. He was a mathematics undergraduate at Cambridge, 1920 to 23. This is right after the First World War. And Ramsey clearly was very clever, and he was also very clever as a young child. So he was moved ahead in school. So he went to on a scholarship to a fancy school in the UK called Winchester, where he came top and everything, but he was 2 years younger than the other kids. He was also a pretty big guy, and even as a child, and so people didn't clock that he was 2 years younger. And then he arrives at Cambridge just after the war ends, and now he's not 2 years younger than the rest of the incoming class. He's 6 years younger, because they have all been off fighting the First World War. And we will see that this caused him some problems. Next slide. So this is what the great philosopher G.E. Moore said of Ramsey when he was a first-year undergraduate. In the early 1920s, F.P. Ramsey attended at least one course of my lectures. I had soon come to feel of him, as of Wittgenstein, that he was very much cleverer than I was, and consequently, I felt distinctly nervous in lecturing before him. I was afraid that he would see some gross absurdity in things which I said, of which I was quite unconscious. Next slide. Indeed, Ramsey, so Moore says, like Wittgenstein, I felt nervous lecturing in front of Ramsey. And many of you, but not all of you, will have heard of Ludwig Wittgenstein. He is one of the most important philosophers of the last 300 years. And Ramsey was one of the few people who could counter Wittgenstein. So we'll see that they had a very significant and intense relationship. And I'm going to play you the first of the sound bites now. And this is from Wittgenstein's nephew, Tommy Stoneborough, who knew, of course, his uncle Ludwig very well, but he also knew Frank Ramsey really well because Tommy Stoneborough did his undergraduate degree in Cambridge. He was terrible at mathematics. He was doing a mathematics degree. And Ludwig asked Frank, Ludwig was now in Austria, and he asked Frank to tutor him in mathematics, and the Ramseys more or less took Tommy Stoneborough in. So he also knew Ramsey really well. So if you play the first soundbite.
Because whenever he felt that somebody was wrong, it was wrong. And therefore he'd say it. And that's why he'd stand, I would say, he'd stand up to God himself.
So this is Wittgenstein's nephew saying of Ramsey that when he thought you were wrong, he would just say it. And it didn't matter if it was Ludwig Wittgenstein who was wrong, Ramsey would say it, and he would stand up to God himself. And now, I know that the accent's funny, and I do have subtitles for many of these passages, just not these two. And so now we will hear from Ramsey's widow, who was one of the few women that Wittgenstein was very, very friendly with before and then after Ramsey died.
Frank made him cry sometimes. You know, Wittgenstein was a person who would go on and on and on and on and on. I think Frank found Wittgenstein very trying. I mean, he certainly, he was the person who would wear you down.
So this is Lettice Ramsey saying that Wittgenstein was very trying. He was. He would wear you down. And when I first heard this part of the interview, I thought she said, just because Wittgenstein was so difficult, I thought she said Wittgenstein would make Frank cry sometimes. Because Frank was a kid, and when he first met Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein was this frightening genius, but no, she said and meant that Frank Ramsey used to make Wittgenstein cry sometimes. And he made him cry because he was punching holes through his great work, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. Next slide. So let's just take a quick look at Ramsey when he was an undergraduate. So we're talking about him now when he's 17, 18, 19 years old. His first publication was called The Douglas Proposals. It was in 1922. And next slide. And this was a publication about a work by a guy named Major C.H. Douglas. You'll see why I just want to call him a guy, not an economist. Douglas, in 1920, wrote a book called Credit, Power, and Democracy, and this book launched the social credit movement. Next slide. And Ramsey, Ramsey was a socialist, and he was very interested in anything that was being written about socialism and democracy, so he immediately raced to the bookstore and he bought Douglas's book, and he wrote in his diary, wasted 7.6. That's shillings. I don't know how much it is now, but the cost of a book. Wasted 7.6 on Douglas' Credit, Power, and Democracy. Seems confused rubbish. Douglas seems rot. Next slide. And Douglas's theory at the time was that the government should subsidize workers by giving them money to provide them with sufficient purchasing power to buy the goods that they and other workers produce. So you could see why a socialist might be interested in that proposal. And Douglas argued that domestic coal, for instance, should be sold at less than the cost of producing it, with the government reimbursing the colliery, the coal owners, for the difference. And he argued that, argued is too strong a word. He stated that a just price is a quarter of the cost price. And now you might be wondering, well, how's this going to work? The government's going to sell coal at a quarter of the price it costs to make it, and where's that money going to come from? Next slide. And a lot of people afterwards saw through what I'm sure you just saw through. How's that going to work? And this is the Princeton game theorist Harold Kuhn describing Douglas in 2006. Who was this Major Douglas? Briefly, he was one of those crackpots who exists on the fringe of academic economics and whose theories promise a redistribution of wealth that appealed to a large part of the public, including, in Douglas' case, Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. Like many of those offering a panacea for the Great Depression, he was also an anti-Semite who invoked the theses expounded in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in defense of his economic theories. But Douglas was on the verge of enormous power in the early 1920s. The Labour Party in England was considering repositioning their whole policy along Douglas's lines. And Douglas said that he had a mathematical proof that his social credit policies would work. So he had some fancy mathematics in his book. And John Maynard Keynes, pictured there, who we all know from Keynesian economics, he saw through Douglas, and he could see that he was a crackpot, but Keynes was no great mathematician, and so he commissioned this undergraduate, Frank Ramsey, who Keynes had already spotted for being brilliant, to write an article about the Douglas proposals. And he paid Ramsey £100, which is a lot of money these days, and it's actually the only serious money Ramsey ever made from writing anything. But Keynes thought it was so important to have someone examine these proposals that the Labour Party was about to adopt that he paid this young genius £100 to write the article. Next slide. So Ramsey slaughtered the Douglas book. As you can see, he thought it was rubbish and rot, and he just ripped apart the mathematics, and the Douglas scheme just died in England. People said that this was when the whole country kind of pricked up their ears and thought, who is this young man who has shown these proposals by this apparently good mathematician and economist, Major Douglas, to be absolute garbage. Next slide. But of course, that absolute garbage floated across the oceans, and it floated to Australia, but most impressively, it floated to Canada. And the first ever social credit government was in 1935 in Alberta. And it was right-wing and anti-Semitic, and they promised, as an election platform, to give the workers a check for some sum of money. I can't remember what it was. And of course, they never did. They said, oh, well, we have to enact a law, and then they never got around to enacting the law. But I added, actually, this bit of the Douglas proposals because it's local color to this audience. But that was one thing that he did as an undergraduate. Another thing he did, in a way more impressive, Keynes had just written a book called the Treatise on Probability, and Ramsey reviewed it, and Keynes's friend Clive Bell put the effects of Ramsey's review very nicely. He said, Ramsey made a rent, like a tear, in Keynes's theory of probability, which caused the stitches to run. And Keynes's treatise, which had hit the bookshops with extreme promise, was really kind of scuttled by his own prodigy when he was still an undergraduate. But Keynes, although he was not happy about having his theory of probability trashed, he, as we will see, stuck by his prodigy. Next slide. Ramsey also discovered C.S. Peirce in 1924, hence the mention of Mike Kabara introducing me to Peirce also when I was an undergraduate here at the University of Lethbridge. So in January of 1924, we find Ramsey writing in his diary, read some Hobbes, Logic, and Peirce, who is surprisingly good in parts. January 25th, Ramsey was starting to think of writing his undergraduate dissertation on probability, partly interested in it again by Peirce. January 29th, he finishes this fat book of Peirce's collected papers, finished Peirce. And we'll see that he was very influenced by that reading of Peirce. He didn't write his undergraduate thesis on probability. He wrote it on Bertrand Russell's The Foundations of Mathematics. He wrote it on Bertrand Russell's 3-volume book on the foundations of mathematics called Principia Mathematica, written with Whitehead. And this was a very dense 3-volume set. And Ramsey tried to repair a problem that he and many others found in Russell's Principia Mathematica. And as Victor said to me at lunch today, actually it was more like 4 holes that he tried to repair. And this paper of his undergraduate thesis, was, next slide, published in the London Proceedings of the London Academy of Mathematics, and it had a major impact on the Vienna Circle, which was one of the great movements in philosophy in the last century. The Circle talked about the paper, about Ramsey's paper, for 2 weeks in January 1927, and then intermittently right through to 1929. So his undergraduate thesis has this enormous impact on the Vienna Circle. But very few people were good enough to be able to appreciate it. So Ramsey submitted his thesis for the Smith's Prize, which was the big mathematics prize in Cambridge, and it didn't win the Smith's Prize. And we're going to hear the statistician Harold Jeffreys talk about that. So that's Jeffreys that you see there. And talk about how bizarre it was that Ramsey's thesis did not win the Smith's Prize.
It sort of leaked round to me that they'd consulted somebody who said that it wasn't very good, said that his paper wasn't very good. And then Bertrand Russell afterwards consulted and said that his work was first rate, which made various people wonder who the hell was the expert they had consulted.
So, as you can see, I've provided you subtitles for that gem of Harold Jeffreys. I love his giggle at the end. Also, as an undergraduate, Ramsey translated Wittgenstein's very difficult and very important manuscript, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. So in case you're not keeping track here, as an undergraduate, he destroys the Douglas proposals. He destroys Keynes's treatise on probability. He translates the Tractatus. He writes an undergraduate thesis that's so important that the Vienna Circle spends more or less 3 years reading it. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about Wittgenstein's Tractatus, because this relationship between Ramsey and Wittgenstein was one of the most important intellectual relationships maybe ever. So Wittgenstein had started this book before the First World War, and he took his man, he went off to fight in the First World War for the Austrians, because he was Austrian. He was from one of Europe's richest families. So he goes off to Austria, and he was a very complicated person, Ludwig Wittgenstein. And he volunteered to be at the very front, not just for dangerous duty, but at the very front of the front. So often he was in a little basket on a ship, keeping watch while the cannon shells and the bullets whizzed by him. It was almost like a death wish. But he carried around for these years during the war the manuscript that he had been working on in Cambridge with Russell before the war. And he finished it during the war. And after the war, he finds himself in a prisoner of war camp in Italy. And he writes to Russell and to Keynes, "I've finished my great manuscript, and I need to have it read, but I'm in this prisoner of war camp." And Russell manages to go see him. Keynes sends him paper and writing materials and manages to get this manuscript out of war-torn Europe. Keynes, of course, had played and was playing a major role in the UK Treasury Office, arguing that they mustn't destroy the German economic system because that would have terrible consequences. Keynes lost that argument, and it had terrible consequences. So Keynes was a very important international figure. So he could get this manuscript out of war-torn Europe. He did. And it arrives in Cambridge, and they're all looking at it. Russell, who not only was with Wittgenstein before the war, working on this project, but then went and had Wittgenstein try to explain it to him. Wittgenstein said Russell didn't understand it. He said the great logician, mathematician in Germany, Frege, didn't understand it. Moore didn't understand it. And it's true, it was an odd book. It was numbered propositions, not written in a way that any other philosophy book or any book had ever been written. And they just didn't understand who would A, publish it, and B, if they found a publisher, who would translate it. They found a publisher, C.K. Ogden, who was a mentor of Ramsey, a kind of family friend. And Keynes and Russell and Moore, and I guess Ogden, decided that the only person who could translate this mighty difficult manuscript was this undergraduate, Frank Ramsey. So Ramsey was very keen on it. He was, as he said, word perfect on Russell. He was ignoring the mathematics part of his degree and attending all the philosophy lectures. He nonetheless graduated as the senior wrangler in mathematics, which was the top mathematics student. But his diary is full of remarks like, "Oh, I have to study differential calculus because it would be really embarrassing if I failed the exams." But he came first. What he was really interested in was philosophy, so Ramsey said, "For sure, I will translate this." So this is how he translated it. He took the German typescript, and he went to Miss Pate's secretarial office in the Cambridge University typing pool, and he read the German, and German went into his head, and out of his mouth came the English. And Miss Pate took it down in shorthand, someone typed it up, and they had an English translation. That translation went to Wittgenstein, and he had said Russell didn't understand it, Frege didn't understand it, Moore didn't understand it, and of this manuscript, this translation, he says, yeah, that's more or less right. They went back and forth for months, working out the details, and also Wittgenstein changed his mind a little bit. But at the end, he said that the English translation was the more accurate reflection of what he meant than the original German. Next slide. So, in a nutshell, what was in the Tractatus? Well, at its center was what we call the picture theory of meaning and truth. So Wittgenstein argued that meaningful propositions, propositions that might be true or false, are those that can be broken down into their simple elementary parts. And once you have this simple elementary proposition, each simple part has to latch on to or reach out to or connect to some object in the world. The picture, he said, agrees with reality or not. Next slide. And Wittgenstein said we can only express what's in that simple language. Famously, one of his sentences in the Tractatus is, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." So if you can't express something, if you can't express something in this simple language that reaches out to objects in the world, you must shut up about it. You must be silent. So what kinds of sentence propositions are such that you can't break them down and have them reach out to objects in the world? Well, all the propositions of logic and mathematics seem to be not elementary sentences, and Wittgenstein had a kind of nifty way of dealing, a very, very good way of dealing with that. We can talk about it later if you want, but he found a way to make logic and mathematics expressible, meaningful. Causal statements, such as arsenic causes poisoning in human beings. Where's the cause in the world? We know that when a human being ingests arsenic, they get really sick and die, but what's the cause, the thing that makes it such that arsenic causes death? Wittgenstein said, the causal nexus is the superstition, i.e. you're just being superstitious if you believe in causes. Ramsey actually, when he translated that, he translated it as causal propositions are superstitions. And Wittgenstein wrote back and said, no, I said they are the superstition, and I meant it. So causal statements are out. Statements about ethics, religion, the meaning of life, they aren't such that they latch onto objects in the world. And Wittgenstein had a very unusual approach to them. He said, well, they can't be said, they can only be shown. They're kind of inexpressible, but they're higher or more important than all the things you can say in the elementary language. Philosophy, the propositions of philosophy, also don't reach out to objects in the world. And Wittgenstein's answer to that question was, well, if you ask him, well, what about all the philosophy that you just wrote? That doesn't latch on to objects in the world. And he said, philosophy is nonsense. It's literally meaningless gibberish. But you must use my book like a ladder. You use all those propositions of philosophy that I just wrote down, you climb up the ladder, and once you get to the top, you kick the ladder out from underneath you, and you never do philosophy again. So that's how Wittgenstein coped with or explained different sorts of propositions. Ramsey in 1923, still an undergraduate, wrote a critical notice of the Tractatus after he translated it. It still stands as one of the most important commentaries of the Tractatus. And in 1929, he wrote some papers, again, absolutely destroying the view in all sorts of technical ways. And I've argued in the biography, but in other books as well, that it was Ramsey who made Wittgenstein turn his back on the Tractatus and become what we think of as the later Wittgenstein. And Ramsey's kind of pithy argument against the Tractatus is what I've got up here. He says, what we can't say, and we can't whistle it either. So Wittgenstein was famous for walking around Cambridge whistling like whole operas. And what he wanted to say about ethics and religion and the meaning of life is that we can't express these things. We can only gesture at them or show them. And Ramsey said, no, no, no. What we can't say, and don't try to whistle it either in some other way. Next slide. And Ramsey put forward a pragmatist alternative to Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein said a proposition is true if it mirrors states of affairs in the mind-independent world. And Ramsey said, no, no, no. We mustn't think of these abstract things called propositions. We must talk about human belief and think of a belief as being a habit or a rule with which we meet the future. And if our beliefs meet the future well, that's what it is to be rational. And if they meet the future perfectly, that's what it is to be true. Next slide. Okay, all that's Ramsey as an undergraduate. He became a mathematics don in 1924 at King's College, which was Keynes's college, at the age of 21. He was the youngest fellow ever at King's. And here is Ramsey's friend, the philosopher Richard Braithwaite. So Ramsey was an undergraduate at Trinity College. And Trinity is the most famous, most rich, most illustrious college in Cambridge. And Trinity is still put out that they did not hire Ramsey. And here's Braithwaite saying what happened.
Because then, of course, Keynes snapped him up before he got into Trinity. Oh, sorry. Do you know the expression? Pounced.
Right.
Pounced. Keynes pounced. Oh, Keynes got Keynes to pounce. I hadn't realised Keynes' ability to get the college to agree to pouncing.
So Keynes pounced, and Ramsey became a mathematics faculty member at Trinity, or at King's in Cambridge. Okay, so that's a very whirlwind tour of Ramsey's thought. But who was this young man? And he was a young man. He never had the chance to grow old. And I'll give you a little account of his life. Next slide. So his family was very interesting. His father was a kind of jobbing mathematics don in Cambridge, very odd, kind of horrid man. His mother was a very liberal do-gooder. They spent their Christmas days going around and giving food to the poor. And that's his brother over there, Michael Ramsey, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. As Archbishop of Canterbury, Michael Ramsey, head of the Church of England, made his colleagues very uneasy because Frank Ramsey was an atheist. And Michael Ramsey said, our view of heaven can't be right because our view of heaven says atheists can't get in. And if anyone is in heaven, is my brother Frank Ramsey. Next slide. He was a socialist like his economist friends, Morris Daub and Piero Sraffa. Next slide. And he was, as I said, a very young undergraduate, and he got caught up in the Bloomsbury circle. So Virginia Woolf, for instance, said of the Apostles, this very secretive discussion group in Cambridge, that it was the society of equals enjoying each other's foibles. Next slide. That's Virginia Woolf and some of Ramsey's very cool friends in the Bloomsbury circle. Next slide. And this is Frances Partridge, who was also right at the center of Bloomsbury. And here's her recollection of Frank Ramsey.
He was a simple character in many ways, Frank. He enjoyed simple things. He had a tremendous sense of humour. He used to have an enormous laugh. His whole mouth, his whole face cracked when he laughed.
Slide. And these are two other very well-known members of the Bloomsbury Circle. Lytton Strachey wrote to Dady Rylands after Ramsey died, "The loss to your generation is agonizing to think of, and the world will never know what has happened, what a light has gone out. I always thought there was something of Newton about him, the ease and majesty of the thought, the gentleness of the temperament." But Bloomsbury caused him problems because remember, he was young, much younger than his cool Bloomsbury friends, and he was paralyzed about sex. They were all having a lot of it, and he was having none of it. So he went off and got himself psychoanalyzed by one of Freud's students, Theodor Reich. And he was cured by Reich, so he spent 4 months in Vienna being psychoanalyzed, and then his problems about sex disappeared. Next slide. And he immediately contacted a woman, also very wound up in Bloomsbury. When he got back from Vienna, Lettice Coutley Ramsey. She was a renowned portrait photographer and adventurer. And they got married very quickly. And here's Lettice talking about Ramsey.
Is that he was very good at using his great brain to pick out the essential, well, what was important in any situation. I'm not talking now about maths or philosophy or anything, but any ordinary situation. I mean, he would be very good at picking out what, in any human situation, what was the thing that was important.
They had an open Bloomsbury marriage. Lettice insisted on it. She didn't want to get married. She wanted to have fun. And Ramsey had to get married because he was living in college, and if they found out he was having sex with someone he wasn't married to, he would have been fired. And bizarrely, his father, who was in the mathematics faculty at Cambridge, seems to have threatened to tell the authorities that his son was having sex outside of marriage in order to get his son fired. He was a very strange man. That picture is of Frank Ramsey with his two great loves, Lettice, and then the next slide, Elizabeth Denby. So Lettice thought that the great thing about having an open marriage is that you could have a lot of relationships. Ramsey thought that the great thing about having an open marriage is that you could have another great love. And his other great love was Elizabeth Denby. She was a very influential architect and housing reformer for the poor, and the three of them ended up in what Lettice called a happy trio, although, as you can imagine, it caused some problems for them, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. Next slide. He had a lot of famous friends. It's a very famous Chinese poet, Zhu Zimo, Nobel Prize winner in physics, Pat Blackett, and there's Lionel Penrose, and Lionel Penrose is the father of British genetics, and here's Lionel's brother Roland talking about what great fun the Ramseys were.
So one of the first times I met him at Cambridge was when they were giving a party. I remember they were mixing some curious drink with pure alcohol.
So they threw great parties. Next slide. Okay, the last word, or words, should be Ramsey's. And these words are drawn from a paper that he read in 1925 to this secret society, the Apostles, and he titled it, "On There Being No Discussable Subject." So we've seen that Wittgenstein said there were a whole bunch of things that you couldn't discuss. And so Ramsey was playing on this assertion of Wittgenstein's, and the paper really was about the meaning of life. So Wittgenstein had said that you can't discuss the meaning of life or religion, but Wittgenstein himself thought that life was very depressing. He was a very gloomy sort, as you can see from some of his pictures. Next slide. Wittgenstein had also, there's Wittgenstein at his gloomiest. He had also scorned the Apostles as having nothing to discuss. He thought they were a bunch of self-indulgent, clever boys. They're all men. So Ramsey was going to, in this paper, take on Wittgenstein, and also we'll see Russell on the meaning of life. So Russell had just read a paper to the Apostles and argued that you can talk about the meaning of life, you can't talk about it, and it's depressing. So here's Russell. All the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system. The whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. And here's Ramsey's response to the depressing thoughts of Russell. and Wittgenstein. Where I seem to differ from some of my friends is in attaching little importance to physical size. I don't feel the least humble before the vastness of the heavens. The stars may be large, but they cannot think or love. And these are qualities which impress me far more than size does. I take no credit for weighing nearly 17 stone. That's a lot. Ramsey was quite large in the last year of his life. This is 1925, actually. So he continues. My picture of the world is drawn in perspective and not like a model to scale. The foreground is occupied by human beings, and the stars are all as small as threepenny bits. I apply my perspective not merely to space, but also to time. In time, the world will cool and everything will die. But that is a long time off, and its present value at compound discount is almost nothing. Nor is the present less valuable because the future will be blank. Humanity, which fills the foreground of my picture, I find interesting and on the whole admirable. I find, just now at least, the world a pleasant and exciting place. You, Russell and Wittgenstein, may find it depressing. I am sorry for you, and you despise me, but I have reason, and you have none. I pity you with reason because it is pleasanter to be thrilled than to be depressed, and not merely pleasanter, but better for all one's activities. Next slide. His argument was that those who focus on the vastness of the universe and the eventual demise of the planet are on the wrong track about the meaning of life. What we're interested in, what we must be interested in, is the world of human beings and making things better for human beings. We can discuss and assess our feelings about the meaning of life and ethics and religion in these terms, in terms of their impacts on human life, our own and that of others. And his own life, short as it was, certainly had a lot of meaning. Thank you.